Miles Morales. Imagine being born right after a beloved hero dies and everyone immediately blames you for it. That's basically how Miles entered the scene. In Ultimate Spider-Man 160, in 2011, Peter Parker dies a heroic, tear-jerking death. 2 months later, Ultimate Fallout number 4 drops and boom, there's Miles in a spider suit. Fans who had just ugly cried over Peter's last breath looked up and said, "Who's this kid and why is he in my web-slinger's clothes?" That timing felt like Marvel was saying, "Anyway, here's your new Spider-Man," which made people lose it. Then came the diversity wars. Marvel hyped Miles as a milestone for representation. Black, Puerto Rican, smart, funny, heroic, which honestly should have been a win. But some fans got salty about what they saw as that classic corporate move, "Look, we're progressive now." The complaints weren't always about Miles himself, they were about Marvel's marketing, which I think sometimes came off like a press release instead of storytelling. And when people feel like they're being told what to celebrate, they usually dig in harder. What made it worse, of course, the internet. Forums, Reddit, YouTube comments turned into war zones. Some folks were reasonable. Others were being racist gremlins like an army of gypsy crusaders. Misinformation spread fast, including claims about Miles replacing Peter in all comics or being written as better than Peter. None of that was true, but once the outrage engine starts, it never stops. Even fans who did like Miles had gripes about his stories. Early issues wobbled between heartfelt and awkward, and when he moved into the main Marvel universe after Secret Wars, continuity got messy. Suddenly, he was sharing space with a very alive Peter Parker again, and we weren't sure what the rules were anymore. Put it all together, a beloved hero's death, a rushed introduction, some clumsy marketing, and an internet fueled by rage clicks, and you've got the recipe for why parts of the fandom still act allergic to Miles Morales. Angel. Angel's the kind of character who should have had it easy. Rich, handsome, no homo, literal wings, the full heavenly hero package. But Marvel looked at this golden boy and said, what if we ruined him? Over and over again. That's basically been Warren Worthington's comic career ever since. Fans don't hate him because he's boring, well, he is, but they hate him because every time his life starts making sense, someone decides he needs more trauma and a personality reboot. It starts in X Factor number 23, where Apocalypse decides Warren would look better in blue with metal wings, and an urge to murder people. The transformation from Angel to Archangel is comic book body horror at its finest. His wings are mutilated, his mind twisted, and suddenly he's slicing through enemies like a goth gamer girl on steroids. Fans saw that as the moment he stopped being a character and started being Apocalypse's favorite puppet. Then there's the soap opera nightmare involving Cameron Hodge and Candy Southern. Across early X Factor issues, Warren's best friend, Cameron, betrays him. His girlfriend gets lobotomized, and the whole arc dials the tragedy up to 11. It's dramatic, sure, but a lot of us felt like Marvel kept reusing that pain as a free pass for whatever violent thing Archangel did next. Fast forward to Uncanny X-Force number 11, the Dark Angel saga. Warren becomes a near god who plans to wipe out and restart the world. I think it's definitely ambitious storytelling, but a lot of readers saw it as the final straw that the tragic winged boy had officially turned into a full-blown apocalypse event in one man's body. What makes it even worse is how writers kept undoing it all. Deaths, rebirths, clones, amnesia. Warren's gone through more resets than Lazarus of Bethany. Each resurrection made his tragedy feel cheaper, like the emotional equivalent of previously on Trauma. So yeah, fans' frustration isn't random, it's exhaustion. Between the mutilation, melodrama, and endless retcons, Angel stopped feeling like a fallen hero and started feeling like Marvel's favorite lab experiment. Beautiful, broken, and completely overused. Exodus. If you took a medieval knight, dipped him in purple paint, and told him to act like a Magneto cover band, you'd get the headache known as Exodus. Born Bennett du Paris, this mutant was around since the Crusades, but I'm just gonna say he acts like he never left the 12th century. Apocalypse gave him near immortality and enough psychic power to move mountains, which he mostly uses to yell about mutant supremacy. He views Magneto as a literal god, often taking Magneto's ideas and cranking the phantasm up to a level that makes the actual master of magnetism look like a moderate. He spent the 90s as the muscle of the Acolytes, serving as the guy the X-Men had to punch when the writers were saving the real villains for a later issue. Which is a shame because I think this guy definitely had potential beyond that. The reason I find him exhausting is because he lacks the tragic backstory that makes other mutant villains interesting. Instead of having a soul, he just has a massive ego and a wardrobe full of unnecessary spikes. He speaks in a fake Shakespearean dialect that sounds like a theater student who had too much caffeine and not enough talent. On top of that, his power levels are all over the place. One day he's fighting the entire Avengers team by himself, the next day he's getting knocked out by a stiff breeze. He represents the era of comics where I guess bigger muscles and louder screaming were supposed to count as character development. While some newer stories try to make him a cool paladin, most readers remember him as the guy who made every crossover feel twice as long as it needed to be, which is why I'm calling him the mutant equivalent of a pop-up ad that you cannot close. Stryfe. If you think Cable is already a confusing character, then this guy's basically him, but the writers decided to make him even more confusing by adding clones and time travel. Stryfe is a clone of Nathan Summers, who was praised by Apocalypse in a future where everyone wears knives for clothes, which I predict might actually be our new fashion trend soon. Because he does not have the techno-organic virus that his brother has, his psionic powers are fully functional, but he mostly uses them to complain about his childhood. He's the leader of the Mutant Liberation Front, but his actual goal is just to make his parents, Cyclops and Jean Grey, feel bad for abandoning him, which is just petty. Fans absolutely loathe him because he is a melodramatic brat in a suit of armor that looks like it belongs to a kitchen drawer. His helmet alone, I would say, is a crime against fashion, featuring enough sharp edges to make walking through a doorway a life-threatening risk. His dialogue is always full of over-the-top angst about his dark legacy, making him sound like a teenager who just discovered gothic poetry. What I think makes it a lot worse is that his backstory is a total nightmare to explain to anyone who hasn't spent 10 years reading X-Men wikis, because it's so confusing I can't even explain it. He's also responsible for the Legacy Virus, a plot point that killed off fan-favorite characters like Magic and Colossus and dragged the comics into a decade of misery. He represents the worst parts of the 90s. Confusing origins, impractical costumes, and endless shouting about things nobody cares about. He's basically a walking Swiss Army knife with the personality of a damp firework and even less utility. Bastion. What do you get when you shove two giant mutant hunting robots through a magic portal and give the result of a goatee and a boring office job? Bastion is the fusion of Master Mold and Nimrod, two classic Sentinels who merged into a human-looking hybrid with a very specific hatred for mutants. He led Operation Zero Tolerance, a storyline where he turned regular humans into sleeper agent cyborgs to hunt down the X-Men. Unlike the classic giant purple robots, Bastion looks like a middle manager who is about to deny your vacation request. Fans generally dislike him because he headlined a crossover event that many felt was the low point of the late 90s. But what irritates me the most is the fact that he is a dry, humorless bureaucrat whose primary power seems to be having as much plot armor as the writer needs. He could shrug off attacks from the most powerful mutants on the planet just by saying his system's adapted, which of course feels like a total cheat. His stories are often bleak and depressing, focusing on mutants being put into work camps and stripped of their dignity rather than fun superhero action. Because he sometimes looks like a normal guy in a suit, he lacks the visual excitement that usually comes with X-Men villains. There's also the issue of Sentinel fatigue, where readers get tired of seeing the same robots want to kill everyone plotline over and over again. Bastion is the most cynical and tedious version of that trope, representing a time when X-Men comics felt more like a chore than an adventure. I guess nothing says menacing supervillain like a guy who looks like he's about to explain your tax bracket. Hindsight Lad. If you ever wondered what would happen if a toxic Reddit moderator got lost in a spandex warehouse, meet Carlton LaFrog. Carlton is the guy who looks at a burning building and tells the firefighters they're holding the hose at a statistically inefficient angle. He has zero powers unless you count being a monumental buzzkill as a genetic mutation. He essentially blackmailed his way onto the New Warriors because he figured out Speedball's secret identity and threatened to leak it. This basically starts off his speedrun of being one of the most annoying heroes in all of Marvel, because while most heroes earn their spot by stopping bank robberies, Carlton got his by being a neighborhood snitch with a hobby for extortion. He then bought a costume and started calling himself Hindsight Lad, which is honestly one of the most punchable names in comic book history. He spent his time sitting on the sidelines pointing out everything his teammates did wrong after the fact. He was already annoying at first, but then the Stamford tragedy happened, where an explosion unalived multiple school kids. This event kicked off the Civil War when the New Warriors were blamed for the massive explosion. Instead of being a loyal friend, Carlton went full villain in the most pathetic way possible. He created a website dedicated to ruining the lives of his former friends. He put their real names and addresses online, which led to their families being attacked by angry mobs. He sat safely behind his monitor while innocent people suffered because of his desperate need for clout. Fans despise him because he's a realistic coward who uses intimate secrets as weapons. He acts as a moral judge while being the most untrustworthy person in the room. For me, there's nothing heroic about a guy who trades the safety of his friends for a few clicks and a sense of smug superiority. I guess his only real superpower was making everyone wish they had his hindsight to never meet him. If you think this guy was already annoying, then buckle up because we're just getting started. Judas Traveller. During the 90s, Spider-Man went through a storyline called the Clone Saga that was so messy it almost killed the character's popularity, and Judas Traveller was the cherry on top of that disaster. He was introduced as an ancient godlike being who traveled with a bunch of weirdos to study the nature of evil. He spent his time putting Peter Parker through psychological torture, but the thing is, the writers had no idea who he actually was or what he was trying to do. He would show up and do things that looked like magic, only for the story to later claim it was all an illusion, which I genuinely think made every issue he appeared in feel like a waste of time. Fans hate him because he was a mystery box character where the box turned out to be empty. He felt like he belonged in a completely different comic book, like he wandered out of a Vertigo title and got lost in Queens. The eventual explanation for his powers was that he was just a mutant with a god complex, which I find so underwhelming that it made the previous 2 years of stories feel like even more pointlessness. He represents a time when Marvel editorial was just making things up as they went along, hoping the readers wouldn't notice. His dialogue was filled with pretentious philosophy that didn't actually mean anything, making him incredibly boring to read. He's basically the comic book version of a philosophy student who thinks he's deep because he wears a trench coat and talks in riddles. The High Evolutionary. Herbert Wyndham is the kind of guy who would kidnap your dog just to see if he could give it thumbs and a degree in philosophy. This guy started out as a human scientist, but eventually decided that natural evolution was moving too slow for his liking. That's when he built himself a suit of silver armor that makes him basically a god and set up shop on Wondergore Mountain to play with DNA. He isn't trying to take over the world in the usual way, he just thinks every living thing is a rough draft that needs his heavy-handed editing. His success started when he created a race of animal people called New Men, and even made his own version of Earth called the Counter-Earth. This might be a great achievement, but the reason fans find him absolutely repulsive is because he has the emotional range of a laboratory fridge. He treats sentient beings like science fair projects. If he thinks a species is an evolutionary dead end, he has no problem trying to delete the entire planet. Not only that, he's been involved in some of the most frustrating retcons in Marvel history, especially regarding Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. He's spent years messing with their origins, revealing he experimented on them when they were babies. He also views the most powerful heroes in the universe as broken toys that he needs to take apart. That's when I think that there is a specific kind of cold, calculated cruelty to his actions that make him harder to like than a traditional villain. He doesn't have a tragic backstory or a relatable motive. He just has a massive ego and a petri dish. He has literally turned heroes into puddles of goo just to prove a point about biology. What makes it even more annoying is his constant monologuing about the greater good of science while he performs horrific experiments on people who are still conscious. He acts like a benevolent teacher while behaving like a deranged butcher. We readers find his smug, detached attitude infuriating because he never feels bad about the lives he ruins. He is essentially a cosmic snob who thinks his intelligence gives him a license to be a monster, and that's exactly why he made it on this list. Inhumans. If Marvel fans have a group they love to dunk on, it's Inhumans. A royal family of moon-dwelling weirdos who somehow keep finding their way to the center of Marvel events. Problem isn't one single character, it's a pattern. Every time Marvel decides the Inhumans should be the next big thing, readers roll their eyes, and for good reason. At their core, the Inhumans are built on some pretty dicey lore. They're a secretive society ruled by a royal caste, obsessed with genetic destiny, and historically propped up by servant classes like the Alpha Primitives. It's all very space monarchy with eugenics on the side, which can already make them hard to love. When stories lean into their aristocracy and rigid Terrigen rituals, it feels less like a relatable drama and more like a lecture on why hereditary rulers are cool. What makes it even worse is the way Marvel pushed them in the 2010s. After the Inhumanity event and the Terrigen mist cloud floating around Earth, suddenly there were new Inhumans popping up everywhere and tie-in comics multiplying like rabbits. Instead of organic storytelling, it read like Marvel trying to manufacture a franchise. Fans felt buried under events and spin-offs, and fatigue set in fast. Then came Inhumans vs. X-Men, where their beloved Terrigen mist was killing mutants. Instead of nuance, readers got a blunt storyline that made the Inhumans look like villains defending toxic gas for tradition's sake. On top of that, it looked like Marvel was propping them up at the expense of the X-Men, which hardened the backlash even further. So the grudge against the Inhumans isn't just about Black Bolt's bad parenting or Medusa's mood swings. It's about years of forced spotlight, shaky ethics, and a sense that Marvel kept trying to sell fans a dynasty they simply didn't want to buy. Sins past Gwen Stacy. Sometimes a character is so beloved that a single bad story could turn their entire legacy into a radioactive crater. Gwen Stacy was originally the gold standard for superhero love interests, the sweet and bright woman whose death defined Superman's journey. For decades, she was the symbol of Peter Parker's lost innocence. Then, the Sins Past storyline arrived and decided to set that entire legacy on fire for absolutely no reason. The writers revealed that before she died, Gwen had a secret affair with Norman Osborn, the guy who eventually murdered her. Not only did she sleep with her boyfriend's worst enemy, but she also had secret twins in Europe who aged at double speed because of Norman's goblin blood. We fans were absolutely disgusted by this change. It took a character who was defined by her loyalty and goodness and turned her into someone who was hiding a gross secret from Peter. The thing about all this is that it didn't make any sense with her established personality or the timeline of the original comics. It felt like the writers were trying to be edgier by dragging a dead character through the mud. Because the idea of Gwen Stacy falling for a creepy older businessman who was also a known psychopath was a bridge too far for almost every reader, as it turned her tragic death into a weird soap opera mess. This version of Gwen isn't hated because she's a villain, but because the story felt like a betrayal of the fans' trust. I'm calling it character assassination in the most literal sense. On top of that, it made Norman Osborn look like an even more cartoonish creep than he already was. The backlash was so intense that Marvel eventually had to spend years trying to fix the damage with even more complicated retcons. For a long time, the mere mention of the story was enough to start an argument that any comic forum on Reddit. It remains the ultimate example of how to ruin a perfect ending by adding a middle chapter that nobody wanted to read. At this point, it's safe to say that it takes a special kind of writing talent to make a bridge toss look like a second worst thing to happen to a person. Romulus. If you thought Wolverine's backstory was already complicated enough, Romulus arrives in 2007 to make it 100 times worse, which is enough to earn him the top 3 spot on this list. He was introduced as an ancient mutant who had been secretly controlling Logan's entire life for centuries, from his birth to the Weapon X program. He claimed that feral mutants like Sabretooth and Wolverine didn't evolve from humans, but from a separate line of wolf people called lupines. This idea was so terrible to many fans because it ignored decades of X-Men lore just to make one guy seem more important. If I'm being honest, it felt like a bad fan fiction that somehow made it into the actual comics. Romulus was designed to be better than Wolverine in every way. Stronger, older, and smarter, which I'm sure you agree just made it feel like a Mary Sue villain. His look was also pretty silly, featuring long white hair and gloves with claws on them because apparently he couldn't grow his own. By retconning him into every major event in Wolverine's history, the writers took away Logan's agency and made the Marvel Universe feel tiny. It turned a legendary hero into a puppet for a guy who looked like a rejected member of an 80s hair metal band. The lupine theory was so unpopular that Marvel eventually had to walk it back and admit it was mostly a lie just to fix the damage. He represents the kind of writing that thinks bigger is always better, even when it ruins the foundation of the character. He's proof that you can have all the power in the world and still look like a bargain bin Sabretooth. Maria Hill. If you combined a high school principal with a top secret spy agency and a massive chip on her shoulder, you would get Maria Hill. This girl took over S.H.I.E.L.D. after Nick Fury went into hiding, and she immediately made it her mission to treat every superhero like a ticking time bomb. While Fury was a guy who understood that heroes were necessary, Hill is a bureaucrat who thinks the world would be better if everyone followed a very strict set of rules. I dislike her mainly because she is the personification of government overreach. During the Civil War event, she was the one ordering soldiers to hunt down Captain America. She didn't even wait for the law to be officially signed before she started trying to arrest people. Not only that, she treats the Avengers with utter contempt, despite the fact that they have saved the planet from alien invasions more times than she has filled out a form. What I think makes her even more unlikable is her total lack of accountability. She's constantly making massive, dangerous mistakes, and then acts like she is still the smartest person in the room. For example, she once created a secret prison called Pleasant Hill, where she used a cosmic cube to brainwash villains into being happy civilians. This was a massive human rights violation that obviously blew up in her face, yet she still acted like the heroes were the ones being difficult. At the end of the day, the girl is smug, condescending, and perpetually annoyed that people with capes are getting in the way of her paperwork. She doesn't have any powers, but her ability to be an annoying authority figure is second to none. She's so annoying that some readers view her as a constant roadblock to the fun parts of a comic book. Every time she shows up in a helicarrier, you know she's about to ruin a hero's day for no good reason. Knowing her, she might actually be the only person who can make an alien invasion feel like a secondary problem comparing to a meeting with HR. Maximus the Mad. Imagine being the king of the Inhumans and having a brother who spends every waking second trying to steal your crown while complaining that he's the smart one. Maximus is the younger sibling of Black Bolt, and while his brother is a silent, regal powerhouse, Maximus is a loudmouth pest with mind control powers. He constantly claims his madness is just a level of genius that regular people cannot understand, which I definitely think is just a very convenient excuse for being a jerk. His entire personality is built on being jealous of his brother, leading him to plot endless coups that always fail in the exact same way. I personally find him frustrating because he is stuck in a narrative loop that has lasted for over 50 years. He pretends to be sane, betrays his family, takes over their city of Atlan for a few weeks, and then gets thrown back into his cell. It's like watching a rerun of a show that's not even that good for the first time. What makes it even crazier is that during the mid-2010s, Marvel tried to make him a top-tier threat on par with Thanos or Doctor Doom. They put him in every major book like Infinity and Uncanny Inhumans, but the extra exposure just made people realize how annoying he actually is. His dialogue often clutters the page with pseudo-intellectual rambling, while the actual heroes stand around waiting for him to shut the hell up. He lacks the physical presence to be scary and the emotional depth to be sympathetic, leaving him in a weird middle ground of just pure irritation. He's the guy at the party who thinks he's the most interesting person in the room, but really, he's just the loudest. You know what my hot take about him is? He's the type of villain whose most dangerous weapon is the fact that people will do anything to stop him from talking. Namor. Namor McKenzie has been around since 1939, which makes him one of Marvel's oldest characters and also one of its most irritating. He's the submariner, half-human, half-Atlantean king, and his entire history is a tug-of-war between noble protector of Atlantis and petty ocean tyrant. That constant swing is exactly why so many readers ended up hating him. Namor's go-to move is extreme nationalism. Whenever Atlantis feels even slightly threatened, his answer is usually to flood a city, smash some battleships, or declare war on humanity in general. In theory, that makes him a tragic ruler trying to protect his people. In practice, it makes him look like a monarch who's always one bad mood away from mass murder. For readers, it stops being nuanced and just starts feeling like the guy really needs better diplomacy skills. On top of that, Namor's interactions with surface heroes are infamous for crossing lines. His decades-long obsession with Sue Storm and Fantastic Four, complete with kidnappings, proposals, and constant attempts to steal her from Reed Richards, reads less like romance and more like harassment. Those moments linger, making him come off as predatory rather than charming. What makes it even worse is his track record of catastrophic choices. Modern arcs often show him unleashing destruction on a global scale, whether it's flooding Wakanda or launching wars against entire nations. Fans remember those disasters, but rarely see him held accountable in a satisfying way. Instead, he gets dusted off later for another round of maybe he's noble, maybe he's evil, and this cycle repeats. That inconsistency, sometimes tragic king, sometimes cartoonish warlord, only deepens the dislike. Readers don't see a layered anti-hero, they see a reckless autocrat who keeps getting free passes. Starfox. If you want to know why Starfox is one of Marvel's most disliked adventures, just look at his powers. He can stimulate the pleasure centers of people's brains. On paper, that's cosmic charm. In practice, it's a walking constant nightmare, and fans have never really forgiven him for it. Eros of Titan, younger brother of Thanos, debuted in the 70s as the carefree opposite of his genocidal sibling. Where Thanos worshipped death, Starfox worshipped fun, flirting his way through cosmic adventures, and charming teammates on Earth. Early stories leaned on him as the lighthearted playboy of the team, but once you add the detail that his powers can make people feel desire or attraction, suddenly that playboy vibe reads a lot more like manipulation. Writers have swung wildly in tone. Sometimes Starfox is the cheeky rogue cracking jokes, other times he's a walking ethical problem. At one point he even helped design a device to help keep telepaths out of people's heads during sex, a detail that only made him look creepier in hindsight. What really sealed his reputation was a mid-2000s She-Hulk storyline where he was put on trial for sexual assault, accused of using his powers to seduce a married woman. The case went deep into questions of consent, memory, and whether Jennifer Walters herself had been manipulated when he hooked up with him. The result was muddled implanted memories and cosmic interventions, powers partially shut off, but the damage was done. Readers now saw him less as a charming Avenger and more like a walking violation. What makes it even worse is that later comics tried to smooth things over, restoring his fun-loving persona and downplaying the trial. Fans, though, weren't buying it. Once a character is tied to broken consent, the unease never really leaves. For Starfox, it's the reputation he'll never escape. Krakoan Era Beast. Hank McCoy used to be the bouncing blue poetry-quoting heart of the X-Men, but lately, he has become something much more sinister. In the modern era of the mutant nation Krakoa, Beast took over the Black Ops team known as X-Force, and turned into a literal war criminal, arguably worse than Joseph Stalin. We hate him now because of his hypocrisy has reached legendary levels. He claims to be doing everything for the safety of his people, but he uses that excuse to commit atrocities. He essentially attacked and lobotomized the entire nation of Terra Verde just because he saw them as a competitor to mutant plant-based technology. On top of that, he treated his own teammates like disposable lab rats. For example, he killed Wolverine multiple times just to see how the resurrection process worked, and then tried to turn him into a mindless lobotomized weapon. What makes the fan hatred so intense is that this wasn't a sudden shift. It was a slow descent into being a self-righteous monster. He acts like his high IQ gives him a pass to ignore basic morality, to the point where he has become a patronizing egomaniac who sneers at anyone who dares to question his methods. He doesn't even think he's a villain, which makes him even more annoying to read. He views the world as a giant chess set where he is the only one smart enough to play. This is a tragic phase for some fans because the lovable scholar who once cared about coexistence is gone, replaced by a cold-hearted strategist who would sacrifice his best friend for a slightly better data set. Readers have been begging for him to get what's coming to him because he has ruined the legacy of one of the original X-Men. He is a walking example of how being the smartest guy in the room can also make you the most dangerous person on the planet. I guess being a genius doesn't include the ability to realize that everyone around you wants to see you get drop-kicked. Quicksilver. Pietro Maximoff is the fastest man alive, which unfortunately means he's also the fastest person to lose his temper. This dude is famous for being the most arrogant and irritable member of the Avengers, mostly because he thinks everyone else is moving in slow motion. While being a bit of a jerk is part of his charm for some, he eventually crossed the line into being genuinely toxic. First off, his overprotective attitude toward his sister Wanda often feels more like a hostage situation than sibling love. But the real wave of hatred started during the House of M event, where Wanda famously said, "No more mutants." While everyone blamed Wanda for warping reality, it was actually Pietro who whispered in her ear and pushed her to do it. He basically manipulated his sister's mental breakdown just so he could live in a world where mutants were in charge. He didn't care about the consequences, he just wanted to be a prince. When the world went back to normal, most mutants lost their powers. Pietro didn't try to make things right. Instead, he went on a crime spree, stealing sacred Terrigen mists from the Inhumans. He then started forcibly repowering mutants with the mists, which ended up killing many of them because of the process was toxic. What makes him even more unlikable is that he never takes responsibility. He always has an excuse, and he always acts like he is the real victim of every situation. What's worse is that he treated his own wife and daughter like obstacles to his ego, even exposing his child to dangerous chemicals of Terrigen mist without permission. Fans find him exhausting because of his redemption arcs never last. He will save the world on Monday, then betray the team by Thursday because someone didn't say thank you fast enough. In the end, he is a narcissist with a speed habit who ruins everything he touches. His personality is as abrasive as a sandpaper suit, and his constant smugness makes readers want to actually see him run straight into a brick wall. If he could actually outrun his problems, he would probably be in a different galaxy by now. Senator Kelly. Most villains in the Marvel Universe use lasers or magic, but I would say Senator Robert Kelly uses something much scarier: a pen and a voting record. He's the face of anti-mutant politics, constantly pushing for laws that treat mutants like dangerous weapons rather than people. He is the reason the Sentinels exist in the first place, and his fear-mongering led to the famous Days of Future Past timeline where the world literally ends. Fans hate him with a passion that is usually reserved for real-life politicians who do not know when to stop talking. But the reason I'm personally so pissed at him is that he is too realistic. He's the kind of jerk you see on the news every night. You cannot just have Wolverine stab him because that would prove his point and make things worse for every mutant on Earth, which, in a way, is pretty much what we see in real life every day. This creates a sense of helplessness for the reader because the heroes cannot solve the problem with a big fight. I also think he's a huge hypocrite, often bugging the X-Men to save him when a real villain attacks and then going right back to his podium to call them monsters the next morning. While some versions of the character eventually learn their lesson, the classic Kelly is just a guy who uses hate to get more power. He's the character who ruins the fun of superheroes by bringing in the worst parts of reality. I hate to say this, but this guy might be the only man who can make a room full of people with superpowers feel like they're stuck in a detention hall. Onslaught. Imagine a sentient armored tank made of pure ego and bad editorial decisions, and you have Onslaught. This guy was born because Professor X finally lost his cool and tried to lobotomize Magneto with a psychic hammer. A bit of Magneto's dark energy leaked into Xavier's brain, and they merged to form a giant purple angry cloud of psionic power. One of the things that I first noticed is that Onslaught looked like he was designed by a teenager who thought more spikes meant more personality. Also, he was a nearly godlike entity that could rewrite reality and bend metal. But his real power was making readers buy 50 different comics just to understand why he was shouting. He arrived during the peak of the 90s, an era when Marvel thought the best way to tell a story was to make it as confusing and loud as possible. The Onslaught saga was a massive mess that touched every single book on the shelves. Fans didn't just hate him because he was a bad guy, but also because he was a giant walking commercial for a reboot nobody asked for. Marvel used him as a glorified garbage disposal to get rid of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. At the end of his big fight, all the major non-mutant heroes had to sacrifice themselves to stop him. This led to the Heroes Reborn era, which was basically a weird alternate universe where everyone had giant muscles and no common sense. Onslaught wasn't a character as much as he was a corporate mandate in a cape. If that's not terrible enough, his power levels were completely inconsistent, changing whenever the plot needed him to survive another issue. He would be invincible one minute and then get punched out the next. But the worst of all is that he turned the X-Men's core conflict into a boring slugfest that lasted way too long. This is where we felt like we were being punished for following the story, as the conclusion just wiped away decades of history for a cheap gimmick. He is the physical manifestation of a to-be-continued cliffhanger that leads to a dead end. For a villain so overpowered, it's crazy to think that his most devastating attack was actually his ability to lower the trade-in value of your comic collection. Captain Marvel. Carol Danvers has been everything. Soldier, superhero, space goddess, and, depending on the writer, the most loved or most hated woman in Marvel. Her story isn't a smooth flight path. It's more like a jet that keeps stalling midair, getting rebuilt, and then crashing into another crossover event. Fans don't dislike her for existing. They're tired because the comics kept yanking her identity, power level, and morality around like someone's daughter at a club. Her saga starts in Marvel's Superheroes number 13 in 1968, and Captain Marvel number 18 in 1969, where she's an Air Force officer who accidentally absorbs alien energy and becomes half Kree, eventually becoming Miss Marvel. Cool start, right? Except every time she settles into a role, the comics throw her into another identity crisis. By 1982's Uncanny X-Men number 164, she upgrades into binary. Glowing, cosmic, and basically untouchable. Suddenly, her power level jumps from punch robots to punch stars. That inconsistency became a long-running headache for writers and readers alike, because it's hard to write tension when your hero can nuke a sun before breakfast. Then in 2012, Marvel decides to relaunch her as the Captain Marvel in Avenging Spider-Man number 9. It's meant to be empowering, with a new costume, new branding, new era, but it also rewired decades of continuity. Some fans celebrated. Others acted like she stole someone's parking spot in the comic history. The editorial push to make her the face of Marvel split the fanbase, and that divide hasn't healed since. And then came 2016 Civil War 2. Carol goes full Minority Report and starts arresting people for crimes they haven't committed yet. It was meant to show tough leadership, but for fans, we saw it as authoritarian nonsense. The event turned her into the villain in her own story, and that image stuck like your ex's memories. Add decades of retcons, name swaps, and emotional resets, and it's no surprise we readers got fatigued. Carol's not hated because she's complex, she's hated because Marvel keeps hitting the reset button. Every time she soars, the comic yanks her wings off mid-flight. Riri Williams. When Riri Williams showed up in Invincible Iron Man number 7, the pitch was simple. A 15-year-old engineering prodigy at MIT builds her own Iron Man armor, and before long, she's flying around as Tony Stark's successor. On paper, that's bold. In practice, the rollout was so fast and heavy-handed that readers immediately split the two camps. Those excited by fresh blood in Marvel's roster, and those who saw her as an unearned editorial replacement for a cornerstone hero. Early issues didn't help. Brian Michael Bendis wrote Riri as effortlessly brilliant, reverse engineering Stark tech without breaking a sweat. Problem was that the comic kept telling us that she was a genius instead of showing the emotional fallout of that genius. Without the messy growth or flaws that made Tony Stark interesting, Riri often read as smug, defensive, or flat. Fans who wanted to see her stumble, screw up, and grow instead felt like they were being handed a ready-made icon and told to cheer. Cue the dreaded Mary Sue label. What makes it even worse is how the marketing tripped over itself. The infamous J. Scott Campbell variant cover sexualized a teenage Riri in a midriff-bearing pose, sparkling outrage, and getting pulled. Instead of building goodwill, Marvel managed to make their new hero look like the product of tone-deaf decisions, which only fueled the sense that the whole launch was mishandled. On top of that, the backlash wasn't only about storytelling. Some of it got ugly, with critics mixing in racist and sexist attacks alongside legitimate complaints. Defenders rightly point out that later creative teams gave Riri sharper depth and a more grounded voice, proving she had potential beyond the botched debut. Still, for many readers, the memory lingers. Riri Williams as the hero Marvel tried to fast-track before she'd earned her wings. Scott Summers. If there's one X-Man who can clear a room just by lecturing in his serious voice, it's Cyclops. For decades, Scott Summers has been the dutiful leader. The guy bark and stay in formation while everyone else gets cooler one-liners. But the same dependability slowly curdled into a reputation for being sanctimonious, stiff, and just plain exhausting to read. The cracks really showed once Scott started making calls that pushed him from rule follower to hard-edged strategist. He created and led the X-Force, a Black Ops kill squad designed to take out threats before they could hurt mutants. For readers who grew up on Xavier's dream of coexistence, watching Scott greenlight assassinations felt like a betrayal. On top of that, his leadership during the Utopia and Schism years, when he clashed with Wolverine over the future of mutant kind, cemented the idea of Scott as inflexible and doctrinaire, the guy who always thinks he's right even when it tears the team apart. What makes it even worse is that his personal life only reinforced the image. His long relationship with Jean Grey was full of tragedy, but when she died, or was presumed dead again, Scott moved on with Emma Frost. For some readers, that felt less like growth and more like cold opportunism. Add in his recurring stoicism, secretive streak, and the occasional revolutionary turn, and suddenly the Boy Scout of the X-Men was seen as a control freak with emotionally blind spots. To his defenders, Scott is the man who kept mutant kind alive when extinction was on the table. The guy making impossible choices so others could survive. But for his critics, he's forever the nagging team captain who swapped warmth for pragmaticism. In other words, the perfect mutant general and the perfect character for fans to love to hate. Mephisto. Mephisto is Marvel's version of the devil, and while he has been a great villain for Doctor Strange, Spider-Man fans want him erased from existence. The source of this legendary hatred is a story called One More Day, where Peter Parker makes a deal with Mephisto to save his dying Aunt May. The price for this favor was Peter's marriage to Mary Jane, which Mephisto literally wiped out of the timeline. He's hated because he was used as a tool by Marvel's editors to reset Spider-Man's life because they thought a married hero was too old. It was a move that ignored years of character growth and made Peter look like a coward who would deal with a demon rather than accept the natural death of an elderly relative. Because of this, Mephisto is not just a villain in the story, he's a villain to the fans themselves. Every time he shows up now, it feels like a slap in the face to anyone who liked the Peter and MJ relationship. He represents the refusal of the company to let their characters evolve and grow up. Unlike other villains who try to take over the world, Mephisto's greatest crime was taking away a happy ending. He's the face of editorial interference, making him the most metatextually hated character in the entire Marvel library. In the end, I guess Hell's greatest devil is less scary than the people who thought that script was a good idea. Charles Xavier. Charles Xavier may look like the wise, wheelchair-bound father figure of the X-Men, but if you actually read through decades of comics, he starts feeling like the professor dad and more like that one boss who keeps saying, "Trust me," when hiding files in the shredder. Sure, he founded the X-Men with dreams of coexistence, but the way he runs things often comes across as manipulative, self-righteous, and ethically questionable at best. The biggest red flag is his telepathy. Xavier has a bad habit of poking around people's heads without asking. He's erased memories, planted suggestions, and straight up tampered with people's minds whenever he thought it was necessary. In theory, it's to protect them or the world. In practice, it's paternalistic control, like grounding an entire generation but on a psychic level. Fans don't forget that kind of violation. On top of that, he's got a history of ghosting his students. More than once, Xavier has faked his own death, disappearing during crises, or withheld crucial information. Every time, the justification is strategy. But for the kids left behind fighting Sentinels, it looks a lot more like emotional cowardice wrapped in tactical spin. What makes it even worse is the fallout from his own hubris. The most infamous case, shutting down Magneto's mind during a fight, which helped create the monstrous psionic entity Onslaught. That wasn't just a bad call. It triggered a crossover event that nearly broke the Marvel Universe. Hard to keep preaching moral authority after that one. To top it off, writers can't decide if Xavier is a saint or a schemer. The whiplash makes him feel less like a noble leader and more like a manipulative hypocrite. No wonder so many fans view him less as a hero and more like a cautionary tale with great PR. The Sentry. Imagine if a fanfiction character with the power of a million suns was suddenly inserted into every major historical event in Marvel history. That's the Sentry, a hero who was retconned into existence in 2000. The story claimed he was everyone's best friend in the 1960s, but everyone just forgot about him. The first thing that makes us fans hate him is because he feels like a massive Mary Sue character who was forced into the spotlight. Also, he is so powerful that he breaks the logic of every story he's in. For instance, he once tore Ares the god of war in half like a piece of bread, which made every other hero look useless. His presence usually means the writers have run out of ideas and needed deus ex machina to end the fight. If the villain's too strong, the Sentry just shows up and wins instantly. If the heroes need to struggle, the Sentry is conveniently having a mental breakdown in his room. This The Void alter ego he has was supposed to make him deep, but it usually just made him a repetitive plot device. That's not weird enough. He was once suddenly Peter Parker's mentor and the Hulk's best buddy, even though he hadn't existed in the comics for 40 years. This makes me think that it was disrespectful to the actual history of the Marvel Universe. He was a character designed to be the most important person ever, but he didn't earn any of that weight through actual storytelling. I found it boring because there was no tension when he was on the page. You either wanted for him to win everything or waited for him to cry and leave. He was ultimately a cosmic power fantasy that didn't fit the grounded world of the Avengers. Every time he solved a massive crisis with a single punch, it felt like a slap in the face to the characters who actually had to try. Sometimes I feel like he could save the entire world and still have everyone wishing he had just stayed in his room. As terrible as everyone is on this list, I don't think they could even compare to our rank topper, Reed Richards. If you ever wondered why Marvel fans roll their eyes at Reed Richards, it's because it's Mr. So-Called Fantastic has earned himself a much spicier nickname, Mr. Fantastic. And honestly, once you look at his track record, it's hard to argue with the branding. Reed is supposed to be the smartest man in the Marvel Universe, but the problem is that his genius often leaves wreckage behind. He's been written as a selfless hero, cold utilitarian, obsessive schemer, and in an alternate universes, straight up villain. What's consistent is his arrogance. Reed doesn't twirl a mustache, he commits his sins through lab coats and equations, choosing problem solving over, say, basic human decency. He hoards knowledge, builds negative zone prisons, without anyone asking, clones people because why not, and treats his teammates like lab rats in service of his grand ideas. On top of that, Reed is the face of the Fantastic Four's messy family drama. His marriage to Sue is legendary, but mostly for the dysfunction. Readers have seen decades of him sidelining his wife's feelings in favor of experiments, ignoring his kids Franklin and Valera until their lives spiral, and treating family time as another chance to test a gadget. What makes it even worse is that he's often convinced he's doing it for their own good, which makes him sound less like a father and more like a condescending science dad who always thinks he knows best. Modern runs only sharpen the resentment. Jonathan Hickman's Multiversal Council of Reeds storyline shows dozens of alternate Reeds coldly playing God, making it clear that the real Reed is just one bad day away from the same. That ethical chill is why the nickname stuck. Reed Richards may stretch his body, but fans know he stretches patience even more. Hank Pym. Hank Pym should be remembered as one of Marvel's great inventors. He created Pym particles and even helped found the Avengers. Instead, he's remembered as the guy who slapped his wife and built the genocidal murder robot. Not exactly the resume you want on your superhero LinkedIn. The infamous moment comes from Avengers 2:13 when Pym and his unstable yellow jacket persona struck Janet Van Dyne during an argument. Writers have tried for decades to frame it as the product of a breakdown or a chemical influence, but the panel itself became comic book infamy. For readers, that image was permanent. Hank wasn't a flawed hero anymore, he was an abuser. From that point on, most writers either sidelined him or leaned into his instability, turning him into a cautionary tale rather than a trusted avenger. Then there's Ultron, the ultimate bad science project. Pym uploaded his brain patterns into a robot and surprise, Ultron turned homicidal, wiped out cities, and came back every few years to remind everyone that Hank's arrogance basically built Marvel's most persistent killer AI. Each Ultron story isn't just another fight. It's a spotlight on Pym's original sin of thinking he was too smart to fail. What makes it even worse is Hank's constant identity shuffle. Ant-Man, Giant Man, Goliath, Yellow Jacket. Add in alcoholism, mental breakdowns, and dissociation, and the character often feels less like a hero and more like a case study. Fans never know if they're getting a redemption arc, a tragedy, or another disaster. Marvel's tried to fix him, therapy scenes, court-martials, guilt-ridden monologues about Ultron, but the damage sticks. For many readers, Hank Pym is forever the genius who hit his wife and unleashed a robot apocalypse, and no amount of particle physics can shrink that baggage away. Ultimatum Magneto. The Ultimate Marvel Universe was supposed to be a fresh start for fans, but the version of Magneto found in the Ultimatum event turned it into a nightmare. After his daughter Wanda was killed, this Magneto decided to reverse the Earth's magnetic poles, causing a global flood that murdered millions of people in a single afternoon. This wasn't the complex, sympathetic revolutionary from the main comics. This was a genocidal lunatic who killed beloved heroes in the most gruesome ways possible. He famously snapped Professor Xavier's neck like it was a dry twig, a moment that I think feels like it was designed just to shock people rather than tell a good story. This character is top in this list because he single-handedly destroyed an entire line of comics that people had spent a decade enjoying. The Ultimatum event was filled with unnecessary gore and mean-spirited writing, and Magneto was at the center of all of it. He turned a universe that was once exciting and modern into a grim, edgy wasteland that made me think it was written by an angry teenager. There was no nuance to his actions, no political message, and absolutely no soul. He was just a monster used to clear the board of characters the writers didn't want to use anymore. The backlash was so strong that the Ultimate Universe never truly recovered its popularity. He's the ultimate example of how to ruin a legendary character by stripping away everything that makes them human. That, for me, is enough to make him the most hated villain in all of Marvel. Would you agree? Civil War Iron Man. Tony Stark is usually the cool billionaire with high-tech toys, but for a few years, he was basically the most hated man in the Marvel Universe. During the original Civil War storyline, Tony decided that he knew what was best for everyone and led the charge for superhero registration. While his argument about accountability made sense on paper, his methods were straight out of a villain's handbook. First off, he built a secret prison in the Negative Zone, a place that literally causes depression, and threw his former hero friends in there without a trial. Then he decided to start working with some of the worst villains in history. He hired villains like Bullseye and Venom to hunt down heroes who didn't want to sign his papers. The peak of his villainy is the Ragnarok incident. Tony helped create a cyborg clone of Thor that ended up unaliving a hero named Goliath. Instead of feeling guilty, Tony just shrugged it off as a necessary cost of his plan. If that's not bad enough, he also manipulated Peter Parker into revealing his secret identity on live television, which led to Aunt May getting shot and Peter's life being destroyed. If you were Peter here, what would you do to Tony for basically destroying your life? Write your thoughts down in the comments. During all these years, he was cold, calculated, and incredibly arrogant. Fans felt like the character they loved had been replaced by a fascist in a shiny suit. Even if you haven't read the comics and only know Tony from the movies, I'm pretty sure you would feel that way too. Because he stopped being a hero and became a corporate enforcer who was willing to ruin lives to win an argument. But the absolute worst thing is that the writers made him so unlikable that the only way to fix his reputation was to literally give him a brain reboot and a later story to erase his memory of those events. It was a desperate move to make him a good guy again, because the version of Tony that fought in the Civil War was completely irredeemable. Tony might be able to build a suit of armor that could withstand a nuclear blast, but I doubt it could protect him from a universal thumbs down from the readers. Kilgrave. If Marvel villains were ranked by sheer creep factor, Kilgrave would be sitting right at the top in his purple suit. Known as the Purple Man, he doesn't need lasers or cosmic gauntlets to terrify people. His body gives off pheromones that let him control anyone around him with just a word. That means your free will isn't yours anymore, and the simple fact is why readers despise him more than almost any other Marvel antagonist. Kilgrave first appeared way back at Daredevil number 4, and even though he wasn't robbing banks with style, he was making other people do his dirty work. That's his whole thing. Crimes that erase agency. It's not just that he kills, steals, or manipulates, it's that he forces victims to carry it out, making them instruments of his own suffering. That kind of villainy hits different because it feels invasive in a way you can't punch your way out. What really burned him into fan hatred was his role in Atlas and Jessica Jones storylines. Kilgrave spent months controlling Jessica, trapping her in a cycle of psychological torture and coerced acts that left her with deep trauma long after he was gone. The comics didn't treat this like a cheap cliffhanger. They framed it as abuse, PTSD, and the lingering pain of surviving someone who rewrote your autonomy. Readers came away disgusted by him. That disgust is the point. What makes it even worse is that Marvel keeps bringing him back. his power's too narratively tempting, so even after prison, death, or defeat, he resurfaces ready to ruin lives all over again. With forced marriages, children conceived under manipulation, and endless examples of stolen will, Kilgrave isn't just another bad guy. He's one of the most universally hated monsters in Marvel's library. Marcus Immortus. There are bad characters, and then there's Marcus Immortus, a character so vile that his existence is a permanent stain on Marvel's history. He appeared in the infamous Avengers number 200, a story that is universally regarded as the most offensive thing the company ever printed. Marcus is the son of a time traveler who lived in a dimension called Limbo. Because he was lonely, he decided to rebirth himself on Earth. To do this, he kidnapped Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, and used a mind control machine to make her fall in love with him. He then impregnated her with himself, sent her back to Earth, and was born as his own father. We hate him because this is, in every sense of the word, a story about cosmic rape and manipulation. Like, how do you justify this? But it doesn't stop there, because how the other Avengers reacted will make your blood pressure raise higher than Snoop Dogg. Instead of being horrified that their teammate was kidnapped and forced into a pregnancy, they were happy for her. In fact, they treated the whole thing like a beautiful romance. At the end of the issue, a brainwashed Carol actually leaves with her abuser to go back to Limbo, and the Avengers literally wave goodbye with smiles on their faces. It was a complete failure of basic human decency from the writers and the characters. This wasn't just a bad villain plot. It was a gross violation of a female character that was treated as a joke. My hatred for Marcus is absolute because he represents the most tone-deaf and disgusting era of comic book writing. He isn't a villain you love to hate, he's a character that should never have been created. It took years for later writers to even begin to fix the damage he did to Carol Danvers' character. He is the ultimate example of a story that fails on every possible level, from logic to morality. That's why if he has a million haters, then I am one of them. If he has one hater, that's me. If he has no hater, then I am no longer alive. Paul Rabin. If you want to understand why Spider-Man fans groan at the mention of Paul Rabin, buckle up. This guy managed to trip every wire in the fandom minefield without even being a supervillain. Paul shows up in Zeb Wells' current Amazing Spider-Man run, and at first glance, he's fine. A bookish survivor from a wrecked alternate Earth, the son of Benjamin Rabin, who just so happens to be the murderous emissary of the Mayan death god Wayep. Already not the best in-law situation. When Peter and Mary Jane get stranded in Paul's world, MJ sends Peter back to safety, but ends up stuck there herself. Thanks to time shenanigans, she spends about 4 years surviving alongside Paul. They even raise 2 kids together, kids who later turn out to be magical constructs tied to Rabin's creepy glyph math, which basically translates to imaginary children designed by a doomsday cult. Yikes. On the page, Paul is written as capable and selfless. He helps MJ survive, tinkers with jackpot tech that will fuel her superhero failure, and mostly plays the part of quiet support. But to readers, Paul doesn't feel like a character. He feels like an editorial crowbar wedged between Peter and MJ. On top of that, his family ties to the very villain who wrecked everything stain him with guilt he never earns back. Fans wanted him to either go full heel as a traitor or prove himself worthy of MJ. Instead, he just kind of exists awkwardly. What makes it even worse is the way he arrived. Off-panel, mid-mystery, paired with MJ while Peter is sidelined. To many, that felt like the coldest of retcons, a slap to decades of storytelling. So now Paul Rabin isn't just a name, it's shorthand for Marvel messing with Spidey's love life. And trust me, fans won't be letting that go anytime soon. That's it for this one. If you liked the video, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you never miss a drop. Craving more stories from comics, movies, and beyond? Check out this video right here. Cheers, and see you in the next one.